Good evening, everybody. What are you going to do next Friday? Well, it's Good Friday. Next Friday is Good Friday. So we'll be doing the Taizé prayer service. Yeah, you're good. So that's a good step up for some quiet time of silence and solitude. So yeah, please do not miss the Good Friday Taizé prayer service at 7 o'clock. It's the place to be on Good Friday at that time. Okay, I want to begin this evening by reading for you from the scriptures. So let's do so in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. A reading from the Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy and my burden light." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. You know, you try to understand this passage of Jesus from the perspective of John of the Cross's journey, and boy, it just comes alive. So we talk about the rest. What is this rest that Jesus is talking about? And I think that rest is that final divine union. But it invites us first to be humble. And one of the things that John of the Cross says about the purification and the purgation is that it makes us humble, realizing that we are not our own saviors, that we are not our own gods, but God is the one who brings about even this desire, this purification in us. It's what God is doing. So to be meek and humble requires willing to be purified and purged. And remember that we have only done one part of the purification and the purging, which is the sensual part of the soul. The second part is where God is going to do bulk of the work. So to take my yoke is to join with Jesus in this journey. And the rest, we can talk about the infused contemplation that is given as a gift. We talked about infused contemplation. We'll talk about that today just a little bit as well. We talked about that last time. Now, folks, listen to me. Before we go into today's topic, which is the benefits which the night of the senses bring to the soul. Before we go to this topic, I want to talk about, because we have dealt with the dark night in the last 6 weeks, it's not all dark. But our focus has been the dark night, so it seems like it's all dark. But if you were with me in that first 8-week series that I did during COVID, that was in the living flame of love, and that had a completely different mood to it, because we were talking about the height of spiritual union while possible in this world. And so that was it's possible, if you are doing this for the very first time, to think, oh my gosh, John of the Cross, this is all about the dark night. Well, it is for this series, but if you read the spiritual canticle, or if you read the living flame of love, it is about the fruit of the dark night, or where dark night takes you. And that's when you rise above the darkness and come to the light. Okay. We ended last time by talking about the second, third, fourth, and the fifth lines of the dark night, and we are going to very soon come to the 6th, but we're continuing with that section which we call I Went Out Unseen, and we ended there last time. But then he has 2 chapters, John of the Cross has 2 chapters in the first book of the Dark Night, and which he calls of the benefits which the night of the sense brings to the soul. And the very first benefit, by the way, the notes that you are reading, it is a repetition. Most of it is repetition from last week, but I did not want you not to have brought your notes, so I printed them new for you, and so you have a little bit of repetition there. So if you're following with me, the biggest gain, the most central gain that the soul has from the night of the sense is infused contemplation. What do we mean by infused contemplation? This sense of divine union, which is not created by me, but which has been infused into me as a gift from God. So it's infused contemplation. And John of the Cross calls this night and purgation of the appetite is full of happiness to the soul. So finally you hear the word happiness after 6 weeks towards the end. Okay, we are getting to what this is all supposed to be about. And the analogy that he gives goes back to that mother who is trying to wean the child and let it grow a little bit. And the example he uses is that of Abraham. Abraham, remember Abraham's son Isaac, after how many years of waiting, in old age, Sarah and Abraham have a child, and this is the child that at one point would be invited, God would invite Abraham to sacrifice, but it's before he does that, Abraham is weaned from his mother, but Abraham throws a feast for that. And so what the analogy that John of the Cross is making is that the dark night is a weaning, right? And so really speaking, it is meant to bring about growth, and then when this infused contemplation happens, the result of that weaning is what the soul experiences. And so there is tremendous amount of happiness. And I want to read, and I want to actually read what he writes to kind of understand the sense and the happiness that he talks about. This glad night and purgation causes many benefits, even though to the soul it seemingly deprives it of them. So numerous are these benefits that just as Abraham made a great feast on the day his son Isaac's weaning, there is rejoicing in heaven that God has now taken from the soul its swaddling clothes, that he has put it down from his arms and is making it walk alone. That he's weaning it from the delicate and sweet food of infants and making it eat bread with crust. And that the soul is beginning to taste the food of the strong. Parenthesis, the infused contemplation of which we have spoken. So now these, in the times when we were in just an ordinary prayer, where we did not care about the purification and purgation, and there was some sweetness, but that sweetness was all just milk. So God weans you, and now God is going to give you and giving you bread with crust. In many parts of the world, we don't cut the crust away. That's the favorite part of the bread, right? And so bread with crust, which is the infused contemplation, which in these sensory aridities and darkness is given to the spirit that is dry and empty of the satisfaction of sense. So the satisfaction of the senses is what the first part of sweetness that ordinary folks like us who have been praying without understanding this get. So the moment we don't get that sensory sweetness and satisfaction in our prayer, we get frustrated and we think God is abandoning us for one, or people think they're falling back. But if we are moving along the path that John of the Cross is laying before us, which is dealing with the appetite of the body in the way it should be dealt with, and trying to pay attention to the appetite of the soul, the dark night that follows prepares us for this. The dark night, in some sense, is the weaning, and then it prepares us for this infused contemplation. Right? So the rationale here is very simple. This is not a surprise to you. We've been talking about this over the last 6 weeks. So infused contemplation is the greatest gift that we get. Now, there are other benefits that flow from the infused contemplation. He mentions quite a few of them. First of all, knowledge of self and its own vileness. The analogy that he draws here is of the people of Israel on the way from Egypt into the promised land. So they had put on all the jewelry that they can because they're going from slavery into freedom. And of course, these jewelry, then they take off and make the golden calf and all the rest of it. And so God tells Moses and the people, lay aside thy ornaments. So John of the Cross says the soul during this dark night learns the reality of its own misery. When the soul has put on the garment of heaviness, of aridity and abandonment, hear what he says. When the previous lights have become darkness. What are the previous lights? The old ways in which we used to experience satisfaction, and we thought that was it. That has ceased. So my old lights have now become darkness. Then it possesses and retains more truly that excellent and necessary virtue of self-knowledge. Hear this again. Counting itself as nothing. Counting itself as nothing. Learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart. That was the scripture we read today. Counting itself as nothing, and having no satisfaction in itself, because it sees that of itself it can do nothing. Without me, you can do nothing. Jesus says that in John chapter 15. Without me, you can do nothing. The soul comes to this realization of itself. And I think often I hear in confession, and often I hear people talk about, my biggest sin is pride. And people don't know how to address it. What shall I do for pride? Now, if we do enter the journey that John of the Cross is proposing, finally you get to realize that, honestly, you are nothing. And the reason why we think that we're all the time is because we are constantly satisfying the appetite of the body, of the ego, and feeding it, because somehow we have been taught that, we are it. Nobody dare cross our path. Nobody dare cross me as I'm driving along on the street. How many have problems with just driving? Somebody cuts us off, and boy, the best of our Christian character comes out, But it's all about me. And so John of the Cross teaches us to adapt this nothingness. I'm nothing. And get to the point of, and that sense of nothingness is a very dark night, because there's no self, it's not there's no self-worth, but that self-worth is not coming from you, or you're depending on other people to give it to you. You're waiting for that from God. There's an absolute sense of nakedness, emptiness. So this diminished satisfaction with self and the affliction it feels because it thinks it is not serving God, that's feeling that you have, this nothingness that you feel. And the soul feeling that, oh my gosh, am I doing something wrong? That sense of emptiness, nothingness, meekness, humility, God esteems more highly than all former delights and all its good works. So, knowledge of the self and its own limitations, its vileness, that's another benefit of the dark night. And yet another benefit, the soul learns to commune with God with more reverence and respect. In its own day of sweetness and consolation, the soul was less observant of reverence, or the favors it then received rendered the soul somewhat bold with God. And boy, you know what? As I look back at my own, I have mentioned this before, in my own, and perhaps I came to the realization because of John of the Cross, but there were times that I dared to fight with God. And I was told, in some spiritual direction that it's an act of faith. And I get what the spiritual director was saying, but I don't agree with it anymore. I have been so angry with God because some prayer for healing was not met. Somebody's tragedy is so crazy. And I said, God, how can you be so insensitive to, are you deaf? Are you dead? These are all things that I've said to God. And I considered this, I'm okay with God. God understands what I'm saying. And now I realize what John of the Cross is saying over here is that sense of reverence which I had at one point belonged to that part of the sensory satisfaction. But the dark night brings a different kind of reverence for God, a respect for God. Moses, the analogy that John of the Cross gives is that of Moses. Moses has the experience with the burning bush, and he rushes towards it, and God says, take off your shoes. And Moses and John of the Cross says, for having put off the shoes of desire and sweetness, he recognized profoundly his own wretchedness in the sight of God. For so it became him when about to listen to the words of God. I think I may have typed something wrong over there, but he's greatly profound of his own wretchedness in the sight of God. But then he has to put off his shoes and enter into that moment of reverence and respect, to even listen to the word of God. And then, of course, Job. We've heard of Job. John of the Cross says, Job never experienced the depths of God's mystery in his days of prosperity. Honestly, it happens to many of us. When everything is good, where is the contemplation on God's mystery? God left him in misery, in bitterness and grief, and it was then that Job understood the deep mysteries of God's wisdom are revealed to him. So the dark night is not wasteful. The dark night is not something that is incidental to the journey. It's essential to the journey. But you have to understand that the dark night is really not the dark night. If you thank God for his writings, we can approach it that way. Another benefit, God enlightens the soul, making it see not only its own misery, but also God's grandeur and majesty, which is this reverence and respect we're talking about. John of the Cross says that when the desires are quelled and sensible joy and consolation withdrawn, that is the consolation of the sensual part of the soul, the understanding remains free and clear for the reception of the truth. I think I've mentioned this before. If I'm constantly fulfilling the appetite of my body, first is the body, just itself. And then there is the sensual part of the soul, which is I'm looking for consolation and sweetness in that which is very satisfying, right, in my prayer life. But even with the bodily part of it, the more I am just not concerned about purification, purging, even of legitimate pleasures, how much am I really concerned about the appetite of the soul? And this is where he's giving us purifying your life and purging your life, certainly of those things that are contrary to God's will. And those things are the 7 deadly sins, right, we talked about. The more you purge, the freer you are to address the appetite of the soul and to pay attention to it. Then the attention is shifting from the physical to the spiritual. The sensible joy and the desire of even spiritual things darken and perplex the mind. But the trials and the aridities, the dryness, also enlightens and quickens the understanding. In Isaiah chapter 28, verse 19, he says, "Vexation alone shall give understanding in the hearing." Vexation. Vexation shall make us understand how God in his divine wisdom proceeds to instruct a soul emptied and cleansed in a supernatural way. So this struggle, this vexation is key to the spiritual journey. Here's another benefit to the soul. The soul also acquires spiritual humility. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavily burdened, and I will give you rest. And learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart." Folks, without humility, there is no growing in spirituality. And sometimes it's very easy to deceive ourselves. If all your prayer, if all the spiritual exercises that we are doing, if all the meditation that we do, if all the masses we attend and everything that we do, if it does not lead us to and originate from humility, we are not growing spiritually. We might think that we are doing a lot of good things, and that satisfaction is for John of the Cross. That is not where the true fruit lies. Amid the dryness, the aridities, the dark night, the emptiness of this night, the empty night of the desires, the soul acquires spiritual humility, which is the opposite of the first capital sin, spiritual pride. The humility acquired by self-knowledge, remember we said the first of the things is self-knowledge. We get self-knowledge of our own weakness, of our vileness. That self-knowledge purifies the soul from all the imperfections into which it fell in the days of prosperity, sweetness and satisfaction. For now, seeing itself so miserable, it does not enter into its thought. Pride does not enter into its thought, even for a moment, to consider itself better than others. Because you've been in the most darkest place, there's no room here for spiritual pride. In fact, you see other people as better than you. Previously, it was the other way around. Another benefit of the dark night, out of this grows the love of neighbor. No longer judges them, as it used to do before. How many of you struggle with judgmentalism? And I'll tell you, I preach about it all the time. I'm the worst culprit. And sometimes it's not that I'm deliberately judging. It's that first thought that comes to my mind, and then I say to myself, Satish, so if you're still struggling with judgmentalism, remember, we are nowhere even close to the dark night. We haven't hit there yet, guys. So in this dark night, because the soul learns humility from the self-knowledge of its own vileness, is not dependent on itself anymore. It's not fulfilling the appetite of the body or the sensual part of the soul, but it's now dependent on God. There is a different sense of how I look at other people. So now, it sees others as better than the soul because it sees its own misery. In this state, the beginners, so we are about to enter the state of the proficients. After the spiritual dark night is when we will become the state of perfection. The beginners are submissive and obedient in the spiritual way and listen to instruction, and will take advice from anyone who will guide them. The self-presumption which possessed them in their prosperity is gone. And honestly, this ability to listen to other folks is a tremendous. You know, since Father Dave died, I have been pretty much the pastor alone at St. Helena and Immaculate and then St. Mary's. And so, I mean, in terms of decision making and everything else, finally it kind of just rested with me. And now I have Father Len and I have Father Uriel, right? And I have to listen to two other people. And it is hard. Those of you who are married know what this means. I'm not married, but now I have two people that I have to treat and with respect and reverence. And the best way to do is to listen. And sometimes I say it was better when it was alone because it is easier. Humility, right? I need a good dose of it. Unless we learn all this, tell me, and now this is a realization, unless we learn all this, how can, when Jesus says, and I will give you rest, unless I enter into the stage, how is my soul going to rest? If my rest is not what I am giving myself, but if my rest is Jesus, there has to be total self-emptying. And John of the Cross teaches us that way. And then there's another chapter he talks about of other benefits which the night brings to the soul. One is spiritual, the healing from spiritual luxury. Remember I talked about sometimes in prayer when the entire body is kind of, you have feelings and thoughts that are not typical of sometimes holy thoughts, impure thoughts. These are all that will arise during prayer, happens. So the dark night, one of the benefits is healing from that spiritual luxury, what he calls it. There is a constant consciousness of God with the sense of awe it deserves. The soul practices many virtues, patience and long-suffering, which are well tried in the Aridities. Patience, I talked about humility. Who else struggles? Pride, humility, patience. How many of us struggle with patience? But because we are not in control and we are waiting for God for that infused contemplation, the soul learns patience amidst the long sufferings. It is well tried, the soul persevering in its spiritual exercises. Now there is a constant consciousness of God with a sense of awe it deserves. The soul also develops fortitude, strength. The soul becomes stronger, right? Formerly, if I did not get something that I was going my way, I would get angry with God. But now that is not the case. The soul develops fortitude because the soul works without sweetness. I'm not all the time waiting for that sweetness and comfort and consolation to come all the time. No, I'm waiting. I'm not creating comfort for myself. I'm not creating consolation for myself, spiritual consolation and peace. I'm waiting for God for that infused sense of peace and contemplation. And so the soul becomes stronger because it is working without sweetness. In this night, the soul obtains these four benefits mentioned here: delight of peace, constant remembrance of God, purity and cleanliness of soul, practice of all virtues. The soul is also purified in its aridity from the desires of the imperfections of the other capital sins, envy, anger, sloth, and acquires the opposite virtues. The 7 deadly sins, spiritual sins that we spoke about a few sessions back, those are replaced by its virtues. So what is the opposite of pride? It's humility. Of lust, purity and cleanliness of the soul. Blessed are the clean of heart, shall see God. So, softened and humbled by these aridities, the dark night, by the hardships and temptations and afflictions. I love what he says here. It becomes gentle with God, with itself, and its neighbor. The soul gets seasoned. This is the meaning of being weaned and God teaching us to grow. The sins are replaced by virtues. But it is learned in the hard way, going through this dark night. So now the last line of the first stanza. My house being now at rest. Now this part of the notes, that's new. That was not in the last times. This is new. This night, where one stage has ended in rest, it's only a rest because the next stage, which has been more horrible, is about to begin. So you have this sense of infused contemplation, and then that will cease. Why? Because the spiritual part of the soul has still to be purified, not by myself, but by God. So more trials are going to come. So this is that spiritual growth now. So we have only finished the first book of the dark night. The second book is that spiritual purification. Which means that the infused contemplation that's going to happen after the spiritual purification is going to be much more intense than the first. So the harder the trials, the more God puts you through that, the infused contemplation is going. So this is the cycle that will continue to happen till we get to the point where we are done with this life and the curtain is torn down and we have this beatific vision and total union with God. Spiritual, okay? So let's go to that because I want to wind all this up for folks in some way with some final notes. Okay. So my house now being at rest. The night where one stage has ended in rest, but another one is about to begin, is an entry into the more awful night of the Spirit. He also says this is not for everyone. Again, why? We do not know. God gives his gifts in the way that God is attended with heavy trials and temptations of the senses And, I don't know what he was talking about in terms of the temptation of the senses, but you would think that you are beyond all that, but there is a trial that comes that is even more awful than the first. And so it's followed with heavy trials and temptation of the senses, sometimes attended by a spirit of blasphemy. Now, I don't know what to call this because I don't know what this is, never been there. The spirit of giddiness. Souls are filled with 1,000 scruples and perplexities. God sends these violent storms and temptations in the night of purgation to those whom he's about to lead into the other night. For if the soul is not tempted, tried, and proven in temptations and afflictions, sense will never attain wisdom. There are two scripture passages that he uses to talk about this. One is Sirach 34, 9 to 11. Do I have that in the notes for you? Okay. So I would ask you to actually go and reflect that in the coming week. In Jeremiah 31, 1 to 8. Both of these, once again, I think the point that he's trying to make is that without trials and temptations, now this time, God is creating purification, right, of the spiritual side of the soul, spiritual purification, that without going through that stage, there is no growing further in our union with God. So how long the soul continues in this night cannot be told. It's not the same in all. It is measured by divine will. It is proportioned by the imperfections of the soul. In other words, the more imperfect my soul is, the more purification that's needed, the longer could be the night. And by the degree of the union in love to which God intends to raise a soul. So if God is intending to raise my soul thus far, perhaps the night is not as long as we imagine, or is not as hard. But if God is inviting me to a level higher, then the dark night is that intense. Now, by the way, isn't this the principle of life? If you want to accomplish something, be very successful, you got to work. The harder you work, the more successful you are. So why is that not applicable to spiritual life? Those who are strong and able to bear suffering are purified in more intense trials, but those who are weak are purified very slowly and with weak temptations, and the night of purification is long. From other souls still weaker, God hides himself that he may try them in his love. For without this hiding of his face for them, they would never learn how to approach him. So dark night really is not a sense of abandonment, but a sense of God hiding in a part of the soul where you can't really get to God like you used to be able to do before. But again, keep the ultimate goal in mind. It is for a more intense and deeper union with God. So that is the explanation for this last line, my house now being at rest. So this rest is now the preparation for a darker night than the one that you have just been through. And so, okay, I'm going to bring this all to a conclusion in some way, and I have 20 minutes to do that. I'm going to try this. So, let me first say this. We have been focusing on John of the Cross. But I want to say to you towards the end, this is not about John of the Cross. This is about you. This is about me. The greatest revelation that John of the Cross has given me is this: I don't have a soul. I am my soul. This body, this sensual, physical self that I have, this is an embodiment of my soul. God is the origin and God is the destiny of my soul, of me. I am not just body and soul, two separate. I am my soul. And I must help me get to my destiny. So yes, we have learned John of the Cross, but honestly, we have now learned more about ourselves, isn't it? As you've been through this week, as you've done some reflection, and you're beginning to realize the kind of person that you are. What is it that's coming in the way between divine union and you? This has been a revelation for me of who I am and who God is. So yeah, put John of the Cross aside, that's okay. He's showing us the way of how we can take ourselves, which is my soul, which is me, to the destiny to which it's supposed to go. I come from God, and I must go back to God. And here the chance is that at the end of my life, on the day that I die, what if we realize that we wasted an entire lifetime that God gave us to do this? Doesn't Jesus say, what profit is there for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? John of the Cross teaches us to pay attention to the soul. Now here's what happens. This body is the embodiment of my soul, and I take care of my body in good ways and sometimes with appetites that I shouldn't be. And for some people, it's all about the body. And so John of the Cross lays the focus back on who we really are. I am my soul. What profit is there to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? John of the Cross shows us how it is done. It is not about the dark night either. It is about the living flame of love. Your soul is supposed to be united with the living flame of love. The dark night is only how we get there. I think, secondly, that John of the Cross gives us a more focused and concentrated journey towards eternity. Listen, my journey of my soul towards God, do you remember the very first talk I gave when, God is never going to abandon the soul, never. Because the soul is part of the divinity. God is the one who created that soul. That soul has to go back to God. But what are the chances that you and I make this journey of my soul an intentional journey, a more focused journey? Isn't that what the Sermon on the Mount is all about? So, let me put it this way. Often, we try to fit the gospel into our lives. Tell me that is true or not. Here's the gospel, and I'm saying, how do I fit this gospel into my life? I'm going to turn the question. The call is to fit life into the gospel. And this is what I believe John of the Cross is teaching me. It's not about somehow we live our lives and, today Jesus said to me, okay, oops, goes into my life over here. No, that's not what it is. I have one life and I got to fit it into the gospel. Now that's a journey. And that is what I mean by making our journey to eternity a focused and an intentional journey, not an accidental journey. Okay. So, what shall I make of prayer? Because this is all about contemplation. What shall I make about prayer? So, I was thinking about how to answer this, and I looked at the three great, there are other great Carmelites too, but the three who are very, very popular. One is Teresa of Avila. And how many people have told me, that's my favorite saint, that's my favorite saint. Having said that, I want you to understand what Teresa of Avila says about the soul. she wrote 3 books, right? So there's the interior castle. So first she writes the way of perfection. And then she writes the interior castle. And then she writes the exclamations of the soul. And then she writes conceptions on the love of God. These are her 4 major works, right? And this is what she writes in the interior castle. I began to think of the soul as it were a castle made of a single diamond or of a very clear crystal, in which there are many rooms, just as in heaven there are many mansions. Now, if we think carefully over this, sisters, she's talking to her sisters, the soul of the righteous man is nothing but a paradise. The soul of the righteous man is nothing but a paradise. The soul is heaven, in which, as God tells us, he takes delight. I can find nothing with which to compare the great beauty of a soul and its great capacity. In fact, however acute our intellect may be, they will no more be able to attain to a comprehension of this than to an understanding of God. For, as he himself says, he created us in his image and likeness. Now, if this is so, which it is, there is no point in our fatiguing ourselves by attempting to comprehend the beauty of this castle. For, though it is his creature, that is the soul, and there is therefore as much difference between it and God as between creature and creator, the very fact that his majesty says that it is made in his image means that we can hardly form any conceptions of the soul's great dignity and beauty. So the beauty and the dignity of the soul is where Teresa of Avila places her focus, and this is exactly where John of the Cross is placing his focus too. Of course, these were friends, they were writing. It is no small pity and should cause us no little shame that through our own fault we do not understand ourselves or know who we are. Would it not be a sign of great ignorance, my daughters, if a person were asked who he was and could not say, had no idea who his father or mother was, or from what country he came from? Though that is great stupidity, our own is uncomparably greater if we make no attempt to discover what we are and only know we are living in these bodies and have a vague idea because we've heard it and because our faith tells us so, that we possess souls. As to what good qualities there may be in our souls, or who dwells within them, or how precious they are, those are things which we seldom consider, and so we trouble little about carefully preserving the beauty of the soul. All our interest is centered in the rough setting of the diamond and in the outer wall of the castle. This is what John of the Cross is saying about purification, right? We all focus on our bodies and how we look and our hair and, and everything else, and not paying attention to the beauty of the soul, which is like a diamond. We worry about the outside of the diamond, but the interior castle, that's a different ballgame. But this is Teresa of Avila. It is said that she and John of the Cross had that spiritual union around the same time. And then you have John of the Cross, and here's the great little saint, Therese of Lisieux. Therese was a rebel. She did not read too much about John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, even though she's a Carmelite. You know why? It was too complicated for her. Her faith journey was very simple. It's called The Little Way. And if you want to know about Therese, I did a 6-week series last Lent. Oh, was it a Lent before that? It's on the same YouTube channel. You'll find that on the Therese of Lisieux. I did that. It was all about simple. Pray as you can. None of this John of the Cross, stuff. She at one point said that these great spiritual people, they do nothing for me. But there is a reason I'm saying that. Listen, if you have a way, a little way, That's your way. Not everybody has to become John of the Cross. I'm just laying out John of the Cross because it's one way, and that's how some people feel called. I feel greatly attracted by it. But Therese of Lisieux did not. Neither with Teresa of Avila, neither with John of the Cross. Yet, this is what she says. He allowed who? God. He allowed my soul to be plunged into the thickest gloom. Dark night. But just going through the simple way. The thought of heaven, which had been so sweet from my earliest years, became for me a subject of torture. The trial did not merely last for days or weeks. As I write, it has gone on for months, and I'm still waiting for relief. So she's going through the dark night her way, even though she never really subscribed too much to Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross. I wish I could explain what I feel, but it's beyond my power. One must have passed through the tunnel to understand how black its darkness is. And again she says, for me, prayer is an uplifting of the heart, a glance towards heaven, a cry of gratitude and love in times of sorrow as well as joy. It is something noble, something supernatural, which expands the soul and unites it to God. It's the same language of John of the Cross, but coming at it from a completely different angle. She was creative about the contemplative order in which she was. And this is where I think we need to be creative. Don't try to, I started this this entire series by saying, don't try to become John of the Cross. He's giving us some tools for union with God. You know now the tools. Use it how you may use it in a creative way to accomplish that same goal that Teresa of Avila talks about, John of the Cross talk about, and Teresa of Lisieux, who's very different from the two of them, spoke about. When my state of spiritual aridity is such that not a single thought will come, I repeat very slowly the Our Father and the Hail Mary. This is Teresa of Lisieux. So she can't pray. Nothing is happening. No sweetness. Dark night, what does she do? Simple things. Pray the Our Father, the Hail Mary, which are enough to console me and to provide food for my soul. This is exactly what John of the Cross says, right? Like, don't trouble your soul too much with this whole meditation, because the soul wants to rest. And doing all this meditative stuff, all this, he says, you're disturbing the peace the soul has. So Therese did exactly the opposite. She would just pray the Our Father and the Hail Mary, and that consoled her. So, where do you go from here? I'm going to say 4 things to you to conclude the series. Pay attention to your soul, not as your soul, but as you. Teresa of Avila says that know who you are. If you ask somebody where you're from, and if they don't know where you're from, isn't that stupid? But even more stupid is if you don't know who you are. So pay attention to your soul as you and reflect on the soul's appetite. Really go home and ask this one simple question. What does my soul need? What is my soul's greatest need? Heaven, isn't it? And what is heaven? Union with God. Heaven is not a place. Heaven is a state of being. The Catechism teaches us that. So pay attention to your soul as you, and pay attention to the appetite of the soul. Especially when you are struggling with bodily appetites that you say, what the heck is going on? Change your focus to, and what does my soul need? Secondly, focus on the ultimate goal of life. You live with eternity in mind. Focus on the ultimate goal of life, divine union with God. Thirdly, focus on purgation, focus on purification. Listen, folks, we need to live holy lives. We need to live pure lives. We need to live good lives. We need to live lives that are consistent with God's will, period. Only then can the soul find rest. And fourthly, make time for silence and solitude. So in these words, I bring to conclusion the 6 weeks of the dark night. I am debating whether to go to the next book is the right thing to do. I do not know. Maybe you can help me to make that decision. But I'm going to, starting tomorrow, I'm going to start reading the second book. It takes a long time to digest and put it down into 6 weeks, so I'll try. Or, I don't know, maybe Teresa of Avila. I don't know. We'll figure out what to do. But help me make up my mind at some point, all of you. Before we end, I have to say the response to this series has been not just from our parish in Dayton, but actually a lot of people in different parts of the world have been watching this, and I want to certainly call out to Janice in Inverness, Scotland. 3 years now, she has been following every series I've done, and she is a woman of tremendous character because her life is hard. She has immense suffering in her life, but I think it's midnight in London right now, in Scotland right now, in Inverness, but she's watching, so she's hearing what I'm saying. And she'll write to me long letters about stuff, so I want to call out to her. Thank you, Janice. And a Carmelite community of nuns in India have been following John of the Cross, and so I want to Sister Pramila and these nuns who've been watching this and sometimes make the community retreat on the talks that we've shared. I want to say gratitude to them because they write and tell me how this has been helpful to them. So if you have found this helpful in any part of the world or in this country, and if you would like to, please write, ask questions, let us know what you think. Give suggestions, please let us know. On that note, I hope you have a very, very holy week. We are entering into the dark night of Christ's life, which will end up in the resurrection, which is divine union with God. And so as you enter into the dark night with Jesus during Holy Week, become part of that journey. That's the invitation. What profit is there if we win the whole world but lose our soul? Good night. God bless.